Perfect. So good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone joining us today. We're very happy to see you joining us to learn more about this webinar focusing on the ISO 37123 indicators for the resilient cities. And today's webinars will be run for 60 minutes. And we will have the interpretation available in French, Portuguese, and Spanish. So you can click the globe icon at the bottom of your screen to select the language. Also, we'll be recruiting the questions if you may have about the webinar content today by sending your question through the Q&A box also at the bottom of your screen. And we're happy to be addressing that towards the end of the sessions today. And so without further ado, I would like to invite Sanjaya Bhatia, Head of the Office for Northeast Asia and Global Education and Training Institute of UNDRR, to kickstart and give you the warm welcome. Over to you, Sanjaya.
Thank you, Mai, and a very warm welcome to all the participants and also our presenters from World Council for City Data. As many of you know, this is part of our series under the Making Cities Resilient 2030, which is the global initiative for promoting resilience among cities. Today, more than 1,050 cities are a part of this initiative, covering an urban population of more than 350 million, plus more than 200 service providers. So the aim of the MCR 2030 is to bring service providers or those who can help cities and the cities together. And World Council for City Data is one of the, of course, the founding member of the MCR 2030, but also a service provider who can help cities achieve internationally accepted standards for resilience. So with that, I hand over to Mai for any housekeeping, and then Patricia to start kickoff.
Yes, thank you, Sanjaya. So I'll be stop sharing my screen. I would like to pass the floor to the WCCD team. Over to you first, Patricia McCarney.
Thank you very much.
She is the CEO of the WCCD and will be giving us the.
Thank you very much, May, and thank you very much, Sanjaya, for the introduction. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning from Canada, this evening, I guess, from many other parts of the world, and this afternoon. So good day to you and good evening. I want to introduce my colleagues from the World Council on City Data who are joining me here today. James Patava, the Vice President, who will join me in the presentation. And I'm also joined by Justine Hamilton-Arvisais and Eleanor Schoeffel, who both work with cities across the world. We're working in 40 countries now, and our team works with cities across the world in helping them to build data with ISO and ISO series. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and begin the presentation. It's visible fine, everything's good. Great, thank you. Okay, so this work I'm going to tell you a little bit about is quite exciting, what has happened with the world of cities and how cities are becoming more and better equipped with high caliber data through this work. I'll start with a little bit of history. We started back in 2009, and we know that cities have tremendous amount of data. The problem, however, is that it's often not apples to apples data. Cities are measuring all kinds of indicators and doing very well with indicators. And some cities have 300, some cities have 100 indicators. But it's just that there were so many differentiations between how it was being measured. So even though things like emergency response time or recycling rates were being measured by cities, they were being measured slightly differently with different definitions, different methodologies, and also often according to different boundaries of the city. So it made for very uneven data. So we set out to build standardized data, and we worked with the United Nations and with the World Bank and with member countries and with probably about 500 cities back in 2009 to help to develop a standardized set of indicators. So we started with the first one, which is we call ISO 37120, and I'll tell you a little bit about this series now. So the first standard that we created was ISO 37120. This was in a technical committee 268, which I helped to found back then because ISO wasn't really thinking about cities in 2009. So in 2012, they established TC 268. I chaired the working group there on city indicators. The first product that came from this dedication to cities and data was ISO 37120, called Indicators for City Services and Quality of Life. We are now rolling this out, and we have worked in actually closer to 40 countries today, with about 100 cities that have already been certified. So it's been a lot of uptake and a lot of success, and I would be very pleased to invite any of the cities that are on the webinar today to join us in this global effort to build high caliber data for cities, so that cities can talk to each other as well and compare and learn from each other with apples to apples data. So there's 104 indicators in this first standard, and we built them across the 19 themes. And all of these indicators were built according to the demands of cities. So it was very much consultation with cities. What are you measuring now? And what are the low-hanging fruit data components that we could build into this standard? Because we wanted to make this first round ISO 37120 like a base document to help cities to report this first round of data. So this is quite easy data, I have to say. It's quite modest. And it's data that most cities have or should have in an aspirational sense. So this is the 104 indicators in 120. Then we were starting to be asked by our member cities in that first 4 or 5 years of the WCCD's creation in 2014. We started to be asked, what about indicators for additional indicators for smart cities? And what about additional indicators for resilient cities? So we went back to ISO and started to build 2 new standards. The first one, ISO 37122, and ISO 37123 is the third standard in the series. And these indicators were in response to what cities were asking for in terms of helping them to become smarter, because data, we feel at the WCCD, is really the essential starting point for smart cities. And then along came 37123, because cities were at risk and they need good insurance, and they need to be able to prepare for and plan for and recover from shocks and stresses, which is very much the language of UNDRR. So we joined forces with Sanjaya and his team at UNDRR, and we started to develop ISO 37123 within the ISO framework. UNDRR became a representative to the WG2 at TC 268, and we started to build indicators for resilient cities. So this is what we've referred to as the ISO 37120 series. So the 3 standards, the base standard, which I mentioned, is ISO 37120, which all cities are reporting on. And then they can also report on 122 or 123. And the early adopter cities for with UNDRR for ISO 37123, because it's quite a new standard, which I will explain now. So today's focus is on, of course, this standard, ISO 37123, that we built with the UNDRR and 37 countries across the world who vote on these and ballot on these draft international standards. So it was published just a year and a half ago. We've been rolling it out this past 6 to 8 months. And we built this partnership with UNDRR first of all, in terms of the work on supporting local resilience with ISO 37123, and now with MCR 2030, to become a core partner of MCR 2030, Making Cities Resilient, which I understand many of the cities on the call today are actively participating in. It's a wonderful program that we're very proud to be a partner of. I want to just say that this standard has become very popular. People are looking at it and thinking about how this data can help to think about some of the shocks, but also some of the stresses that cities are facing on the ground. We think about cities as being the first place where resilience really needs to be built. It's where most of these shocks and stresses are hitting the ground. And so the data is very much put together in a way that helps to build cities' resilience. And I know you're all very familiar with the resilience roadmap of MCR 2030. And I just wanted to mention that as UNDRR was building stage A, stage B, and stage C, and Sanjaya may want to comment on this after, but for cities who are ISO 37123 certified, they immediately move from stage A to stage C. So we're helping cities now, and we're thinking about a new pilot to actually help some of the MCR 2030 cities to move to stage C quickly so that they can start to implement better because this data is quite important for accessing finance, for example. It's very important for bankable projects. Once this data is in place and it's ISO data that the WCCD verifies with third-party verification through our process, it's very important for most of these aspects of stage C. So it's becoming a very critical piece of the work in moving through the stages in MCR 2030. And I'm sure Sanjaya and might want to comment further on that at the end of this presentation. So just a little bit of detail. It's again the same 19 themes across all three standards. In the resilience standard, ISO 37123, there are 68 indicators, so it's a little less. And for early adopter cities, which is the phase we are in now, cities only need to report 34, so half of the indicators as an early adopter city. And that's because this 123 is being tested. We're starting to test and see which indicators are easier, harder, more difficult, data availability, et cetera. So we're doing this assessment as we roll it out. So we would welcome any of the cities on the call to think about this early adopter cities and join the WCCD to move to stage C of the MCR 2030 platform. This is now, I'm just turning to a couple of examples very quickly. As I mentioned, there's 17 themes. So this is the economy theme, the first one. So a couple of the examples of indicators within ISO 37123, disaster loss as a percentage of city product, properties with insurance coverage for high-risk hazards, citizens and investors in cities really look at this number. Percentage of the workforce in informal employment, any kind of precarious households, et cetera, in stress. Resilient cities on 123, also around environment and climate change, which is another theme, one of those 17 themes. Urban heat island effect, annual frequency of extreme rainfall, annual frequency extreme heat events, cold events, flood events. City surface with high albedo materials contributing to the mitigation of urban heat island effects. So those are an example of a few of the indicators in the standard. And lastly, I'll just show you under the theme urban planning, hazard mapping, high risk zones, departments and utilities that conduct risk assessment, the annual number of critical infrastructure flooded as a percentage of critical infrastructure of the city, and water retention measures. So those are just a little bit of an example. When this is all finished, our team, Justine and Ellie and James and I, we work very closely with cities across the world to build these data sets. It's all online. We have a web portal. We open a workbook and we work with you to help report the data. and then we send it to our third-party verifier. At the end of that process, we then hold a certification ceremony with the mayor and city council of all of our cities. We've been doing this remotely, of course, for the last couple of years, but we often also do it in person. And it's a very nice celebration of a data-driven city. We present the certification at City Council, and it's a very nice indication of how your city is moving forward on this trajectory of resilience. Also, when you're finished, this reporting and the certification has happened with WCCD. All of the data is uploaded to a visualization portal. And this is a really interesting place for all of your city to visit and see the data in relative terms, both to visualize your city in comparative perspective with global benchmarking, but also a second part of that visualization portal was to see year-over-year trends. So we ask cities to report every year so that you start to see a really nice trajectory of data. So just to show you on the comparative side, all of the cities will come up when you enter your data, say it's number of higher ed degrees in your city will be highlighted and you'll see yourself in comparative perspective. And this is really a useful tool for so many things, which my colleague James is going to tell you a little bit about, and how this data gets put to use or put to work, as we like to say. And on the year-over-year trends, you can see, for example, air quality, PM 2.5. It's good to have a lower particulate matter, of course, for cleaner air is down here. So you can see a trajectory of your city's progress year over year and start to measure to see how that needle is moving on some of your core objectives and your strategic planning. So with that, I think I should now pass this presentation to my colleague, James Patava, our Vice President, who's going to tell you a little bit more about now how cities are actually using this data, because we thought we were building a data set that was really about performance measurement on city services and quality of life. But then cities started using the data over the last 8 years with us. And it's incredible the kinds of uses that we're seeing, how cities are putting this to using this data and putting it to work. So with that, I will close my presentation. James, would you like to open your own?
I will. Thank you very much, Patricia.
Okay, over to you.
Okay, excellent. Just good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, good morning. Definitely good morning from Canada. It's really a pleasure to connect with you all. Patricia and the team and I are really looking forward to telling you not only a little bit about how important this work is when it comes to collecting data, but as Patricia mentioned, what I would like to focus on specifically is how cities around the world are putting this information to use. Because as we all know very clearly, there are many data reporting initiatives. However, these kind of initiatives really become important when data itself is actually used. So I would like to tell you a little bit about how cities around the world are using some of this WCCD ISO standardized data. As you'll see on my screen now, we've determined approximately 6 key uses that cities around the world are harnessing this data for. And I want to talk a little bit about each one because the data across all 3 standards, including ISO 37123, can contribute to these various aspects in your city. The first piece that we see, because of the nature of the annually reported nature of this data, cities are very much using it for progress monitoring and establishing internal baselines. They're taking this set of indicators and pooling them to understand in a year-over-year way how cities are doing on a particular subject matter or on a particular thematic area. Pardon me, it becomes a very robust tool to both understand where you've been and where you're going, and of course, to message that information to both senior leadership in your city and the public. As you'll see here, we just have a very small example of one indicator, in this instance, number of businesses per 100,000 population, and a short example of how that number can change over multiple years. which again, not only is a nice byproduct of excellent policy making, but it's also a way to engage in great storytelling as well. The next really strong example that we're seeing is cities using this data for global benchmarking, specifically through the WCCD portal that Patricia gave you a glimpse of just a few minutes ago. And really the underpinning idea here is that standardized city data is helping cities to understand how they measure up in a global context, but specifically compared to peer cities around the world. Through the WCCD portal, as a city with ISO data, you can sort yourself based on size, population, density, GDP, to really identify peers from around the world, and then to engage in city-to-city learning with those peers as well. Again, just an example of how you can start to see how all cities start to stack up in a global context. Another really important application is harnessing these indicators and pooling these indicators across all three standards, including ISO 37123 indicators for resilient cities, to map them to city strategy and city strategy documents. What you're seeing on my screen is just a very short example of, a city's strategic plan. You've got objectives down the left side, and then you've got a selection of the ISO indicators mapped to those objectives on the right-hand side. So it's a very quick and easy way to add powerful, globally approved and standardized KPIs that are collected annually to cities' reporting and strategy documents. To give you another example here, this is from a city that we work with in Canada. One of their key strategic goals is improving livability under a rubric of resilience. Probably a similar theme to many cities these days, but you'll notice in the highlights, we've actually shown some really critical resilience indicators that help to support that key goal of improving livability under a rubric of resilience. Another, and I believe the second to last example that I want to give you is harnessing these indicators to monitor progress towards local and global goals. One of our first forays into harnessing this data for this reason was mapping the indicators to the Sustainable Development Goals to allow for very easy, quick, and quantitative localization of the SDGs. But of course, one of our most proud applications of this data is harnessing it to allow cities to move swiftly through the stages of MCR 2030, but more importantly, to use this data to measure progress against goals that cities have set towards MCR 2030, but also even to start to think about how it can inform investable and bankable projects. So this data becomes even more powerful, leveraging it, yes, for global agendas and incredibly powerful global programs like MCR 2030, but even more so when you start to pool these indicators, this powerful group of over 250 indicators across three standards, to start using it for investment attraction and economic development. This is one of the most exciting applications of this data that we've seen, in the sense that it can demonstrate both to the public and private sector why your city or locality is an important destination for investment. We know from here in Canada that federal governments are absolutely hungry for standardized and comparable data to identify where investments should be made, first of all. But they're also interested in this data to monitor progress in a year-over-year way, which becomes very critical, especially when you're thinking of investment for future resilience of cities. Again, one of the most powerful aspects of this information is that when you pool these indicators together, you start to get a very robust picture of bankable projects in your city, in your community, in your region, in your country. And again, because the data is reported on an annual basis, it creates the ability to set a baseline and then monitor progress and results from an investment on a year-over-year basis. And this data-driven investing in both the public and private sector is such an important aspect of building city resilience these days. And again, this ISO framework that we've created helps you to build that data, and again, use it to monitor progress and demonstrate success. My last slide of the day is just very much an overview of everything that we've shared with you today. You know, talking about data that's globally standardized through the ISO process, having worked with incredible partners like UNDRR, annually reported. It's sitting outside of government. And what I mean by that is that in working with the WCCD, cities report the data to us, we pass it on for independent third-party verification. There is an independence to this data that exists when it goes through the ISO process, and an additional level of scrutiny that many cities very much appreciate. It's also helping, of course, to support MCR 2030 and other critical global agendas, something that we couldn't be prouder of. You're creating data-driven municipalities. The state is informing and directing national and provincial and state level infrastructure spending in cities. And again, that's where it gets to that resilience piece about resilient investment and monitoring progress on investment. Without a doubt, it's driving job creation and economic development due to the unique nature of the KPIs and the fact that they are fully numeric, enabling storytelling and profiling of cities. Of course, there's an applicability here to track progress on the climate agenda. Informing city resilient development goes without, resilient city development goes without saying. There's the SDG application, and finally, directing and monitoring strategic planning, which is an application that I showed you. So with that, I'm going to leave you with what has become very much our slogan at the WCCD. Even though we are translating in multiple languages today, we truly do believe that data is a universal language and that it enables cities both to speak to each other, to speak to peers across their country, nationally and globally, but also to internally benchmark and understand how you can properly drive change. And without the standardized data, some of this work really wouldn't be possible. So thank you very much for your time today. I'll just stick on this last slide just for a moment. You'll notice our contact details there, specifically Patricia's contact details. We very much are welcoming any and all cities on the call today to join us, to join the WCCD's over 100 strong cities worldwide, increasingly across 40 countries, and embracing this call to become more resilient, smart, sustainable, inclusive, and prosperous. So with that, I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll turn it back to Sanjaya and thank everyone today for your attention.
Thank you, Patricia and James. So we have more than 155 participants from all over the world, actually, so all time zones, and lots of questions. So one question was about the continent of Africa, and the question was about what in your view or in your experience is the status of data with the cities in Africa, on the African continent, and because the person commenting felt that this kind of data could help also curb insecurity. So yeah, so any or if you have any plans for that continent. Over to you.
Thank you. I can take a first stab if any of my colleagues would like to jump on. Just wave your hand or let me know if you'd like to help answer this. We're working with quite a few cities over the years in Africa. One of the first cities to join was actually a smaller city in Nigeria, Minna, Nigeria. I know there was a question in the chat. Was anyone active in Nigeria? We had a really important partnership there with the planning department in Niger State to help support Minna's reporting on ISO 37120 in the very early days, and we still maintain relations with them. They're challenged, I have to say, as a small city to report this data, but we've been helping them through the years. In South Africa, Cape Town, Johannesburg, Pretoria, and others have also been reporting this data for certification.
Okay, thank you. So there was another question also related to this questions. Wanted to know more the distribution of the 35 countries and 100 cities worldwide, and especially with relation to Africa, but I think that's more covered in this answer. So there is a question about whether the standards, these three standards are TCFD aligned, meaning for the disclosures that are done for climate related. So yeah, you want to just speak on that?
I can answer that. I think one of the important pieces of that on the climate side is that these indicators could be quite useful for cities. We're not in any way partnering with them, though. It's up to cities to use this data to report on climate, but many cities are actually tracking some of the climate indicators on greenhouse gases and SO2 and NO2 and other issues. They're tracking it to various climate agendas, including the Paris Accord. But I do want to add in that chat line question that I noticed, I wanted to say also that ESG was a possible answer to this, because as we expand beyond just climate, the E of environment and social governance, ESG reporting and reporting frameworks, I do want to add that WCCD and ISO are very active on this front right now, because we're thinking about a new standard for cities to be able to report on ESG, so that environment, social, and governance reporting could actually become a really important key lever for cities to use for bond markets. That ESG framework that we're thinking about is quite critical, and it would include the climate agenda as well. So that's in progress. It's a quite exciting moment. There's a whole within ISO, we call it the TMB. I don't want to get too technical here, but the Technical Management Board is in the Central Secretariat of ISO in Geneva. They have launched a advisory group, which I sit on, for ESG, to see where ISO can help to support companies, yes, but also governments on ESG reporting. So my interest, of course, is in city level data to help support cities and municipal governments to report on ESG. We're already seeing cities asking for this. A couple of cities have already started to think about ESG reporting, and this data could really service that need to have a solid and high caliber data reporting framework for ESG. And I'm told by CFOs of cities that if they can get this right and have solid data, ISO conformity, they will actually be more able to tap the green bond market, the social debentures, and also housing bonds. And some cities are starting to implement that. So they're asking for KPIs, key performance indicators, to support those ESG frameworks. It's a really interesting moment for us to think about. And we're working within ISO to develop that now.
Thank you, Patricia. There's another question about in the context of countries which lack technical and technical capacities for data collection. So are any steps taken to harmonize the data that is collected or different pieces, how to match them properly?
Would any of my colleagues like to jump in on this one?
Why don't I can speak a little bit to this, Patricia and Sanjaya. One of the critical steps in the development of the ISO standard was that it was truly made to be global. This is not a set of standards that focuses just on cities in the West or in the global North. It was designed in a way so that cities in Africa, in Latin America, in Canada, in Europe, could all report in some way, shape, or form on these indicators. And that was our starting point, that this standard would be global. So in fact, in the design of the 3 ISO standards, there was significant consideration into making sure that these would work for cities of all sizes, all levels of GDP from around the world. Now, having said that, we understand that there are some challenges in all countries, both in the global north and in the global south around data. We see this at home, we see this in other cities around the world. However, we've become as a group quite attuned to figuring out where this data exists. And the WCCD creates some very robust relationships with data custodians quite effectively inside varying countries. So we work with cities to act as that go-between, to say, look, we know this data is available in some way, shape, or form. Let's either help find it, or if it's still being developed, let's understand how we can speed that development along. The last thing I would say on that too is that we as an organization, in some instances, partner with national ministries, national agencies of countries, because those groups are very interested in this data as well. And they often have the funding to support cities in gathering this data and putting it to use. So there's very many partnership aspects involved in this. But as I said, the underlying principle here is that these are indicators that cities around the world should be able to report on. And that's very important for us.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for clarifying that. So there are a number of questions clustered around, firstly, is access limited to cities who join? That's one. Then secondly, is the data which the city has reported on the portal only available to the city, or is it also available to research institutions of the public? And then a second line along this is how does a city join WCCD and what are the criteria?
Sure, not a problem at all. Those are very common questions, so happy to take a start on them. And Patricia, maybe you jump in where need be.
Sure.
With regards to the access to the data, right now, it's strictly limited to member cities. Very specifically because we're building this network, we're building a network of trust around open and standardized data with these cities. And quite frankly, from a practicality standpoint, as we build it, it is only available to the member cities right now. Having said that, we know there's an appetite for public consumption of data at this caliber. So we're already taking steps to work with this network, with our network of cities and with our technology providers to find ways to make this data available in public in a way that's nuanced and understandable. What I mean by that is that some of this data can actually be quite technical. And as we all know, data without context can be interpreted in many, many vastly different ways. So our next step is to create a platform that contextualizes this information, puts it out there in a way that's understandable to everyone, from city leaders to interested citizens, to lecturers and university students, but in a way that's sensitive and makes sure that it doesn't necessarily paint any of the cities in the network in a negative way, because rankings done through this data are something that we're not in the business of at all. So again, we're being very sensitive about it, and we want to do this in a way that's efficient and effective. So those are our next steps. On joining the network, a much simpler step, we make it as simple as possible. All a city needs to do is to reach out to one of us or the World Council on City Data. info@dataforcities.org is a great email address to start with. We set up a short briefing. We create a certification agreement that we send to the city. And then our team, our data analyst team, once that agreement is signed, our data analyst team led by Justine and working with Eleanor and others, help that city through the process. It's very simple, very streamlined, very straightforward. I believe there's a couple cities in the chat who have gone through this process already. But our focus is to move you through the certification so that we can put you on to putting the data to use, because that really remains the fundamental and most important part of all of this work.
And it will be good if someone can just put in the chat that email address that you just said. So that
I will do that. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
And once a city contacts us, we can send the agreement out immediately. It's a pretty general template agreement for the city to sign back. And then there's a fee that goes with the work. As a not-for-profit organization, we have to pay the third-party verifier. And then as soon as that's completed, the administrative piece, we open a workbook. And it's an immediate opening of the workbook where the data is all there and the cities can report the data, numerator, denominator, calculate. We made it as easy as possible for you. And we will help you to think about where the best sources of that data sits, because sometimes the sources, as James mentioned in one of the other questions, is quite fragmented. Some sits up in national statistics agencies, some sits locally, some sits in other third-party custodian places. So we hope to think about where to claw that data from to make sure it's in the workbook in a timely way.
Thank you. There's a question related to the MCR 2030. So, and this is from a city which is very active has been active in the MCR and the MCR 2030. So they are asking, there is the scorecard for cities, and that also has certain indicators. So the question is it an advantage for cities that completed the scorecard to use this indicator system in the ISO?
I would say yes, because as you know, Sanjaya, when we worked together at ISO, we actually used the scorecard as a set of guideposts for how to develop these particular set of indicators that are now published as part of ISO 37123. So yes, indeed, if you've already started thinking about this and the scorecard has been completed, that you're a step up in this process. Yes,
there are many indicators which are quite similar. And that helps. Yes. There is a question: are the 3 ISO standards available to the public, or is there any way that the cities could view the standards prior to becoming members, so that they can self-assess if they meet those standards?
Yes, the standards, when you work within ISO, once you develop all the indicators and they're published into these standards, ISO takes over copyright. So they're all available to purchase. They're not too expensive. I think 150, 200 euros each standard online in the ISO store. That's the normal route that cities use to purchase them, and all entities for all ISO standards. And they're immediately downloadable. It takes about 5 minutes to do so. However, if a city's interested, we do help to, give them an example of some of those indicators. We have lists of them that we could also, share with a city that reaches out to us, who's interested in certification, to share some of the indicators that would be required.
Yeah. I would just like to pick up on something else that you said, Sanjaya, about cities wanting to self-assess. We often encounter cities who say to us, this is not possible for us. We can't do it. And this is cities here in Canada, this is cities in the United States, Europe, around the world. But I would strongly recommend that any city who thinks this is not doable to reach out to the WCCD, because in working with our over 100 cities worldwide, we have never, and this is including cities of all levels of development, we've never had a city not achieve some level of certification or verification of the data. So even if you believe that this is too, beyond what your city is doing or capable of, I can almost say with 100% certainty it's not. It's an incredibly powerful fundamental starting point to build a more data-driven cities. And what better data-driven city, and what better way to do it than with an already accepted, globally standardized set of KPIs designed initially for performance management. So all of this to say, by the standard, by all means, look at the indicators and methodologies, but the leading experts are framing me on this Zoom right now, who know how to get cities through this and can do it with success. So do not be discouraged, and please do reach out to us.
Yeah, that's very good. There's a question about the competence criteria for the third-party verifier. So how are they selected, and what role do they have?
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of training of the verifiers to help them to understand what needs to be searched, what needs to be looked at. In particular, their role is to examine the source documents that provide evidence of where that data comes from. So it's understanding the formal source documents that support, so that a city just isn't entering a random number. There's some place where it comes from. So we worked with various consulting companies over the years to actually set up what we call the audit protocol. And I said, for example, a city reports number of police officers. How do you prove that? Well, they said they upload a confidential document. It's all encrypted on our back end. And they upload a document to show the number of police officers on the city's payroll, for example. So those kinds of documents and source documents are all uploaded for the verifier, and the verifier has actually a set of verifiers have helped to establish that protocol, and then there's training for them as well.
Okay, thank you. There is another question, or actually kind of more like reaching out. So this person is at the UCLG organized AfriCities 2022, which is going on right now actually in Kisumu in Kenya, and this person represents African Research and Impact Network, and they see a lot of potential with this, but they feel that there is a big capacity gap. So they're asking if there's any specific capacity support that could be provided to urban areas in Africa, and if so, perhaps this is something that you could also reach out to this person bilaterally, also to reach out to the African Research and Impact Network. But any specific capacity support that could be provided?
Yeah, I can speak to this just very briefly. Let me put it this way: there's never enough capacity support to go around. We feel this quite strongly. We're a not-for-profit, so we operate under these challenges ourselves. With regards to a specific program of support for African cities specifically, there isn't anything underway right now. Having said that, we as an organization partner with critical partners like UNDRR and other agencies to go in for capacity or funding support. So if there is an interest in going to a national government or a funding partner in Africa, we would be more than happy to have those discussions more specifically, because agreed, there's a need for increased support to help cities go through this process. It's a process of getting that support is something we're very familiar in doing. It's never easy, but with an appropriately strong proposal, there are definitely people out there interested in funding this information. So long story short, why don't you reach out to us directly and we can have this conversation and see what that can look like and see what kind of exciting work that we can do.
And I would add that the best, sorry, Sanjaya, I would only add that the best bet for this is often the national governments of a single country to help maybe 3 to 5 cities be certified under this ISO work, because we've actually had experience with that, and it seems to work the best. Because in the end, the argument can be made that this data, once it exists within cities across a country, it becomes very valuable to those national ministries. So I can give you the example of in Canada, the National Ministry of Infrastructure supported a rollout of 15 cities for exactly this reason, because some of our smaller cities, some of our northern cities in Canada have a capacity challenge around data. So we helped 15 cities with support from the National Ministry of Infrastructure, who, by the way, really does benefit from having access to apples data across the country, because it informs their investment decisions on infrastructure projects in the country. And so it's a win-win, really. But the support and the financial support to help build the capacity on the ground in cities is what we've been working on with cities. So we would be happy to discuss that model with other countries in Africa. I know we've had a few discussions already with a couple of countries along this line, including Nigeria.
And this network is going to contact you. They've just typed.
Excellent. We look forward to continuing the conversation.
There's a question regarding the UN Habitat Observatory, which is collecting data for SDG 11 on its platform. So they are asking specific to housing and property rights, what type of data is being collected in the ISO?
Mm-hmm. A lot of the indicators, the KPIs around housing came from Habitat, from UN Habitat. So in the early days when we were working with the cities across the world to develop these KPIs, UN Habitat was actually partnering with us on that to help. And we didn't want to reinvent the wheel at ISO, so we actually spoke with UN Habitat and looked at some of the indicators on housing, on informal settlements, etc. And all of those slum housing definitions, all of those are part of ISO. Some of the health indicators came from the WHO. Some of the education ones came from UNESCO. So we were very careful to make sure that these indicators could align. Second part of my answer would include the fact that cities are very interested in SDG reporting. So on not just goal 11, but on all of the goals. So we've worked with UN bodies at UN headquarters in New York and with the United Nations Statistics Division to help cities to align some of these ISO indicators to each of the themes of the SDGs. And that mapping of ISO data to the goals has been quite effective. And we've been working with many cities across the world to help on localizing that agenda to all 17 of the SDG goals, and we've been publishing reports on that over the years.
Okay, so I think you're coming to the end of the questions, but there was one question about, I think in the presentation when you mentioned that this also helps to promote investments. So there is a question on what does bankable, investable project in relation to resilience city mean? And yeah, so I think basically asking to elaborate more how the standard can help bring in investments.
Sure. I might circle back to a little bit about specifically what I was talking to you about that. This data becomes extremely important because we know that investors want to monitor the impact of investment. And when I'm talking about investors, I'm talking about both public sector investment, government level investment, international financial organizations as well, want to be able to identify where funding is going to make the most impact, but also to measure progress against challenges. Because the indicators are fully numeric, because they occupy these 19 broad sweeping themes, you're able to demonstrate what the impact at a citywide level was on a specific investment, on a wide variety of indicators. So that's really the fundamental aspect of this, that this data drives investment by demonstrating a need for resilient infrastructure investment in the first instance, but then it also helps to monitor the impact of the investment as well, which becomes extremely important for soliciting new funding, to maintaining funding or extending funding as well. So it's a very critical numeric piece to attractiveness and also annual year-over-year reporting. But I know this is something very close to you as well, Patricia. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that too?
No, that's great. Thanks.
Okay, so there is one question about this issue of limited availability of data, and as James just said, even if you feel it's too much, there are ways. So could you give some ideas or examples of how the issue of limited data availability at the local level has been addressed?
Patricia, I wonder if maybe Justine or Eleanor might.
Ellie would like to answer this. They're so close to this question.
Yeah.
How do you deal with limited availability, Justine and Ellie?
Sure. Well, I would first say, to reiterate the point that Dr. McCarney and Mr. Patava made, the ISO 37123 early adopters certification allows cities to report 35 of the total indicators, which really brings down the threshold of in terms of number of indicators that are required for certification. So that kind of makes the burden of reporting in the first year a little bit less. But we also work with cities as small as 10,000 to multiple millions to source data both from the city data custodians as well as federal and regional data custodians. So after experience in now coming up on 40 countries, we have a very good sense of where data sits at those levels. And as James mentioned, we've managed to achieve certification in every city. I think it's important to note that cities have more data than they think, and we can certainly help you to find it and make sure that it's compliant with the ISO standard and is truly usable.
Yes, thank you.
Ellie, did you have anything to add on that? Are you good?
No, I think Justine covered it. I would certainly say those steps of building those communication channels in cities can be much more effective than cities think. So I think it's a really valuable exercise as well to understand where the data sits in your city.
Yeah, it's often quite fragmented across different departments. So our team helps to, say this water data, we can help you to reach out to the water department to make sure that the 5 indicators on water are in conformity with the ISO. It often involves some tweaking of existing data just to make sure it aligns, or to the safety department, or to the planning department, environment department. So they help with guiding cities to request that data, because it's there, as they're saying, but it's often a little bit embedded in different departments across the city hall or to ministries or national statistics bodies. But this pooling of this data is very valuable in the end. It really does help to drive change in cities once it's all put together. And the communication channels, by the way, open in cities where water people are talking to transport people, are talking to planners who are talking to environment through the lens of data, which is a really nice byproduct of all this work that we're finding and socializing data in city halls.
There's also a question, I think this would be the last one, and there's also one question about how many cities in Philippines. So I think that somebody can just type in the answer. But there's another question that the Agenda 2030 states that countries should create their own indicators to reflect their needs and development priorities. How do the indicators at the national level fit in with the MCR 2030 and the international standards? So I would just say that the national is the sum of the local. So unless the local achieve the SDGs and the climate goals and the Sendai goals, the national is not going to be able to achieve them. But anything else you would like to reflect on that, especially in context of the ISO 37123 and the national indicators? Is there any tension there?
I wouldn't even call it tension, but I do agree with you, Sanjaya, that this really has to start on the ground with really solid data. And as soon as you get apples to apples data, even within the same country, let alone in the region, you can start having lessons. Lessons start to travel from city to city. How did you achieve this number? We're here and you're here. How can we move our needle to that? And that happens with a network of cities in like this WCCD network of over 100 cities. We hold webinars and they talk to each other about data points and GIS. You know, we have various webinars that help to think about how to use that data. But once you have enough cities in a country under this ISO conformity that are equipped with this data, it does feed up to national level. This is happening in many countries. Like we work with many cities in Mexico, and they're already enough of a voice on the ground to start to build that to national levels and reporting. So I agree with you. It has to start on the ground. And if cities are equipped with data, it's very empowering, by the way. It gives a much stronger voice. Data gives power behind investment decisions. So if you're asking for a new water treatment facility to your National Ministry of Infrastructure, it's okay to go and ask for a new water treatment facility to your Ministry of Infrastructure. But if you have data that says, this, here's where we are, here's where all our peer cities are in our country, in our region, that are already excelling, and we're way down here, you may not want to use that data point to brag how great you are, but you may want to leverage a weak data point like water treatment to make a bankable project. Going back to that, that's an investable project that comes from data. So it's quite empowering to have this, to be equipped with this data, and its ISO conformity is really another added level of trust in that data, which is can be used to leverage investment.
Thank you. And I think we come to an end now. There are a number of comments everywhere about that this was very valuable and helpful, and I think there'll be any reaching out, and we will be sharing the PowerPoint with all those who have joined us today. So with this, I hand over to Mai.
Thank you, Sanjaya, and thank you all of the speakers from the WCCD. I think it's very valuable. If we want to let data speak, we have to work to get the data right. I think it's a very insightful webinar for us to unlock the understanding on what we actually mean a good data for a resilient city. And so thank you so much for that. And we'll be adding not only just the PowerPoint, but the video recording of today's session at the website that we drop also in the chat, and we'll be circulating that also in the email that will be sent through Zoom. So we would like to ask the participant to just provide us with a 1-minute feedback, complete the 1-minute feedback form that we also drop in the chat. And with that, I guess we have had a very good hour of discussion, and we'll reconnect again in the next MCR 2030 webinar. So stay tuned on what's coming up next. Thank you so much, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.